Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this week's edition of Team Tim. I feel like it's July. I mean, it's like 74 degrees here in New Hampshire, but I know poor Jesse, he's got snow. And Brian, aren't you like in the desert? And Tim, I know you're in New York, so like really warm here. I got the window open. I don't even have to have the AC on, but welcome everybody to this week's edition of Team Tim. We're really excited to have everybody here. How you guys doing?
Doing good. I like to say that in Minnesota, we're just kind of your bellwether here, so you can expect some cold in about a day or two. We got 3 inches of snow last night, and we have 30 meat chickens that we have to process tomorrow in the snow. So that is going to be one heck of an interesting day.
Awesome. My daughter does meat. Well, she used to do meat chickens, and now with the new baby, that's a lot of time.
I don't know, Jesse, if I want to ask you, like, how do you end their existence? It's not like on the videos where they spin their head around or anything like that, or
No, it's they have what? Well, let's not to get too graphic for the people that have. Plug your ears if you got a weak stomach, but
it's Halloween. We can let it roll. Yeah.
They make these things, they're called kill cones. So chicken with its head cut off, that's a thing. Like they literally run around crazy. But you put it upside down in there and you take care of it that way, and it keeps the mess to a minimum. Let's leave it at that.
I won't tell you how we used to do it growing up, but so really excited to have our good friend Brian here. I guess what we could probably do is allow Brian to kind of like do his intro. So let me do this. Maybe I'm sure I'm like clicking the right buttons. It's been a hot minute. So Brian, tell us a little bit about yourself, what you're doing over there at Privacy MSP, and thanks for joining.
Yeah, thanks everybody, and excited to be back. So Brian Blakely. Older guy here. So in the 90s, came up much through the engineer ranks, systems engineer, network engineer, that kind of thing. Got bit by that entrepreneurial bug in 1999-ish, and built, grew, sold, exited several IT managed service businesses. The last 10 years or so really speciated narrow and deep into information security and compliance. I was full-time CISO for about 4 years. In a fintech company that processed about $50 billion a year of online transactions, and also compliance readiness, fractional CISO organization too, which leads us to today. And super excited to kind of dig in a little bit and talk about risk. So Tim, thanks for having me on again. Appreciate it.
I just realized I had myself on mute. Yeah, Brian, it's been quite a journey. I've been following you on LinkedIn for a while. Love the kind of content you've been posting. I feel like it really resonates well with the MSPs that sort of come in and listen and attend here at Team Tim Live. I've talked enough. Mr. Schnurr, it's your turn, my friend.
Yeah, Tim, no worries. But so excited for this last episode. What is GRC? We did them out of order a little bit. I screwed that up. What is governance, risk, and compliance? But risk is the most, open topic. It's extremely wide, right? We're talking, it's not something you usually see. If you go on the yellow pages, there's no one you can call for risk, right? Like it's a funny thing, right? And even governance and compliance, governance is probably a hard one to find in the yellow pages as well. But compliance is certainly something that is widely marketed. You're trying to come in line with some kind of law or regulation. So, excited for this extremely broad episode and what comes out of our mouths here. Brian, I've referred him actually recently just because he's incredibly talented background, and certainly with fintech, which is an interesting, right? It's a nexus of technology and financial. If there's not a more regulated space, I don't think you'll probably find it. So Brian has got himself wrapped up in every kind of law possible. So, but anyway, a little bit more about myself. I run a company called Least Trust IT, which does security advisory, but also works with individuals, high net worth investors, doing hardened laptops as well. But let's move on here, Tim or Jesse, before we dive into this extremely broad topic.
Yeah. Hey everybody, Jesse Miller with Power PSA Consulting and creator of the Power Grid vCISO system. As you see the link so appropriately placed there. We help MSPs build vCISO programs, scale them, and do it profitably. I'm excited to be here and talk about risk as one of the topics that's near and dear to my heart, because I talk about it most every day and how MSPs can leverage risk to scale their MSP. But more importantly, I think Tim's right, is that it is probably the broadest or least well-defined topic out of the 3 letters in the acronym. So interested to get into this today and excited for Brian to be here. Obviously, I think there's not a post that he's put out that I disagree with on LinkedIn. Let's put it that way. So yeah, excited to dig in today.
Yeah, it's awesome. And we're excited to be here too. Jesse, I remember something about some janky chair and some risk. Maybe we'll get into that whole janky chair. As you can all see today, I am out at my stand-up desk, right? So if we're talking risk and we're talking compliance and we're talking things like health risks, sitting my fat butt in a chair 12 hours a day for 5 years straight, lots of health risks. So I finally got this beautiful standing desk that was given to me for Christmas. 10 months ago. Up and running, and now I can stand and I can do jumping jacks, and I actually have a treadmill. So as we dive into this risk conversation here today, I suppose I should take my own 2-second plug. So, hey, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Tim Golden, founder and CEO of Compliance Scorecard, where we help your MSP have the risk conversation through our scorecards. All right, enough of that. I could sit here and talk all day about how Compliance Scorecard can help MSPs continue to have the risk conversation. But instead, we have the experts. Well, I should point this way. That can sit here and talk about risk.
Yeah, I mean, you know me, I always like to start with the definition. So let's go around the horn. What's the definition of risk from everyone's chair here? Who wants to go first?
So I'm just throwing this out there, and it's probably not right, but it's the opposite of opportunity. It's a potential for value destruction. So
I like that. Yeah. I am kind of cheating here because I did a course called What is Risk for Empath. I would recommend that you all go check that out if you're not on the Empath platform. But
I don't like this idea of negative risks. I know Brian B is also going through the CRISC. They talk about negative risks. I mean, like, that just makes it too complicated. Go ahead, Jesse.
First slide in the deck for that says the risk is the possibility of loss, injury, or other adverse or unwelcome circumstances. And I think I like what you said, Tim. I think that encompassed it very clearly. Is it's the potential for destruction of value, right? So yeah, Brian, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think defining risk, again, very broad, but at its broadest sense, I think we're just identifying bad things that can happen and getting a plan together to avoid them. And if they happen, a plan to shrink that risk, right? And so I think at the end of the day, especially in business terms, that's how we have to think about it, right? And I think most IT managed service providers tend to overthink this. And I quite frankly, I think what is risk may not be as good a question as why is risk management important, right? And so maybe we can, we talked about risk is very broad, but maybe we could start there. And Tim brings us up a lot around having that risk conversation, right? And especially in the MSP community, risk to a lot of MSPs is defined as vulnerabilities, right? It's very IT-ish, right? Yeah. And so maybe we start there and say, why is risk management important? Why do we need to have these conversations with our clients? And how do we reframe those discussions in a way that business people can react to them, put resources behind them, and mitigate? Right? How do we have that conversation? And I think that why is risk management important is probably I'd like to hear from you guys. Why do you think managing risk in a business, or if you're, nonprofits, right? Some of us out there in the MSP community support a lot of nonprofits. So you're protecting their mission, right? It's not so much about,
Right.
it's always about money, right? It's even in nonprofits care about donors and all that kind of stuff. But,
reputation.
How do we, yeah, exactly. But how do we mitigate risk, and why is risk management important?
Yeah, well, I always thought Risk was the board game that I played growing up, and little did I know, like fast forward 20 years later, 30 years later, being in the space, I'm like, oh no, Risk means something completely different. But there are parallels, right? For those of you that have played the game of Risk, right? Countries taking over other countries and doing that kind of stuff. Well, it's very similar in the small business. We talked about this just not too long ago with another MSP earlier, and it doesn't matter whether you're the enterprise organization with 1,000 people and 1 billion records, or you're one or two, small shop with 1,000 records. It's still risk. Right now, the resources we could throw behind that is different, right? And so when I think of risk, I kind of go a little bit back to what Jesse was saying, which is adverse effects on something, right? Bad milk at the donut shop. I've said that before. Bad milk at the donut shop. That's a risk. Only having one supplier of milk, and now your milk has gone bad. I can't make the donuts. That's risk, right? So, back to Brian, like having the ability to understand the why and having that conversation is really important to us and us as MSPs. So, Jesse, you were going to say something?
Well, no, I think it's really important what Brian said is that it's associated with a decision. Okay, so risk is the induction of data, and the decision is the deduction of the data, right? So when we talk about what we can do for risk and what risks do we have, how do we action those appropriately for our risk tolerance? That's where it's important for businesses and MSPs, right? As you said, every company is going to have different risk profiles and different risk tolerances and different risks to their business. A 10-person SaaS startup is going to have a much different risk than a highly established fintech company, right? So there are going to be parallels. They may work in the same industry. They may have the same regulations to adhere to, but the risks are going to be highly different. And so as an MSP, I think that's where it's important as we start to work from a business perspective to understand that it's the intersection of technology and business is where we need to talk about risk with our clients.
Yeah, Jesse, putting an exclamation point on that. No business owner, stakeholder, C-level executive woke up this morning, yawned, stretched, and said, boy, I really need to address my critical risk on AC4. Gosh, I really need to do that today. That's real important to me. They don't give a shit. They don't. At the end of the day, the business wants to understand how the MSP is reducing risk in the areas that it matters the most. As a business owner and stakeholders, they wake up and they think, I don't want to spend one more dollar than I have to. If you're an MSP and you want to help shrink risk for a client, say, Joe client, Mrs. Client, whatever, I want to make sure you don't have to spend $1 more than you have to. So I need to understand, what are your most critical business functions? How does your organization make money? Right? Yeah. What are those critical business functions? And then I don't talk about a critical vulnerability or a control failure on AC4, blah, blah, blah. Right? I say, you know what? You have significant risk in the critical business function that's driving 80% of your revenue. So which one is going to get their attention?
Right? Why doesn't this risk conversation happen? I guess, Brian, I'll probably ask that to you. Like, how come no one's empowered? No one's wearing the hat? Is it a data aspect? Like, Jesse, I'm glad you mentioned that, right? Is it a contextualization and quantification of risk? Or is it, I guess why in a natural small organization, there's not a risk person, right? There's not a chief risk officer like there is,
The missing link, in my opinion, is there's no connective tissue between risk and business impact, right? So when we're when we're at MSP, we jump right to our risk assessment spreadsheet, which has a bunch of controls, and we say, hey, the probability of this control failing is this, the impact to the organization is this, and it's on a control by control basis, right? Or it's functions, or I'm sorry, it's systems. It's very IT. It's this cloud service or this server or that. It's not tied. Again, it's not having the business context. So when we talk to a stakeholder, we're speaking in a language that they understand. Okay, so we can't take CVSS scores and jump up and down and say you have 1,000 of them, you need to fix them, right? And I think the missing link is saying, hey, if we don't address these things, you have a high probability of a breach within the next 12 months. Or again, let me back up a step. The conversation we're not having, and Tim, you said it a second ago, but is really starting around understanding business context, but in data flow terms. So you start with the critical business functions that drive revenue, and then you start to ask the questions, right? You say, oh, okay, so 80% of your revenue comes from widget making. So tell me more about that widget making. So you're talking to the business, and they say, oh, Joe or Jane or this department, right? So it gets into the people doing processes using technology, right? That's the right kind of flow to have. Humans doing things and enabled with technology. What do IT people do? They go right to technology and start to go the other way. Even when I look at, this is where it gets a little saucy maybe, but even when I look at some of the playbooks out there for like, hey, if you're going to do a VCSO for your first 100 days, ask these stakeholders these questions. And it'll start with questions like, okay, client, tell me your most critical business applications, right? What are your most important applications that you use?
Yeah.
And they're going to rattle off a laundry list of stuff. Oh, we use Sage Intacct, and we use blah, 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 right? But it's not connected to anything with humans doing things using technologies to achieve a business outcome.
Right.
Yeah. Is that because I think it's because they're hyper aware of like the IT risks. So the conversation's always going cybersecurity IT risk, as opposed to, as you said, Brian, like, how does the business work? How does it function? You coming in to do a risk assessment, a gap assessment, you're like, it's almost like you're not asking the right questions. I think, So
and it's not a lengthy conversation, and this is where I think a lot of MSPs silo themselves in the IT world, is they jump right to hardware, blinking lights, white noise, firewalls, switches, blah 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 blah. And I'm not saying that's not important, but you don't lead with that because it's not put in a way that a client business people can understand or relate to it. So you're always siloed as the IT guy, right? You're the IT guy who's asking me about IT stuff that I don't care about and I don't understand and I don't know, right?
And I have a response to that because I learned this lesson. We've talked about it a lot, right? And it's the why conversation. They don't care about the blinky lights unless they're watching Star Trek or Star Wars. Wait, Star Trek or Star Wars? They don't care about the blinky lights. They care about the things that can impact the business. Now, highly technical person, most of my career, writing code, clicking buttons, loving the lights and blinkies. I had to relearn how to have a business conversation. I had to take a couple courses. I had to read a couple books. I had to change my mindset out of the blinky lights, the ones and zeros and the bugs and bits, to be able to sit down with our business owners and speak their language and speak things that are important to them. And as IT people, as people that love to click buttons and geek out on stuff, that is a hard change for us. Now, what an MSP can do is hire for that. Hire those business people that can have that, or maybe partner with somebody that has the I should be doing this. Partner with somebody that has that ability, right? And being able to, if you're too technical and you can't wrap your brain around the business conversation, bring in people that can, right? there's plenty of college kids that are looking for jobs right now that can have business conversations, that can understand risk, hire out of the insurance industry. So that was something that for me, I had to learn the hard way as an MSP. Well, in business first, and then being able to apply that as an MSP.
Yeah. Well, how does this manifest itself, right? And the 500-pound gorilla in the room is that kind of thinking results in the MSP, as you mentioned, Brian, like asking questions really almost as a vehicle to get to a solution, like they're leading to a solution, right? And so
a hammer looking for a nail, right?
Right.
I'm a
right.
hammer and I'm looking for a nail. Yep.
So what are the 4 treatments for risk, right? We all know what they are. It's avoid, accept, transfer, mitigate, right? What do MSPs do? They jump immediately to mitigate. They are asking questions looking like, what do we need to mitigate? When really, I think to Brian's point about not spending $1 more than you have to is taking that like good enough security approach. People hate it when I use that term, but I think it speaks to the approach and saying the order we should look at risk is, can we avoid it? Can we transfer it? Can we accept it? And if we can't do any of those things, right, and stay within our risk tolerance, then we look to mitigate. And so mitigate should be the last choice in a business-focused risk approach. And I think that's the 500-pound gorilla in the room that is hard for MSPs to get their heads around sometimes.
Jesse, it's funny you mentioned that because we talk about, this concept of least trust, lean function, right? Most of that is avoid, right? It's not mitigate. As you said, like, let's build this really good fence and firewall and, we can mitigate anything. We'll let the client do absolutely whatever they want, but they should do, cyber awareness training. But, so it's a different mindset. Yeah. Yeah.
I say that sometimes and people's eyes get really big, like you're being really reckless the way you're talking. But I think you don't want to phrase it that way, but I think we need to, we've corrected one way. We need to overcorrect our thinking the other way to get to a synthesis there. So that's just my perspective.
Yeah, and
Exactly.
I think businesses in the real world, especially as risk professionals, they want to understand crawl, walk, run. You can be in the business world, believe it or not, a little bit pregnant, right? You can be a little bit compliant. I'll give you a quick example in terms of risk-based decisions. It's Ingenicos a couple years ago came out with new credit card machines, right? That needed to be implemented for P2P encryption, right? And so you have businesses that have retail stores, sometimes thousands of them, with sometimes 10, 20, 30 of these credit card swipe machines in there, right? So it's easy to tell a client, oh my gosh, you're at high risk. You need to replace all of these, any fraudulent transactions through PCI you're going to be responsible for and all that. Whereas a business, they look at that and they think, I can't afford $1,000 a pop for each Ingenico card swipe machine at every single location, right? So what they need help with is understanding, how can we do this and mitigate and prioritize and shrink the risk where it matters most. So it's like, okay, you come up with a strategy with your client and you say, let's target the highest volume stores first. And then over a period of 3 years, we are accepting the risk, okay, that these other lower volume stores, until we have money to replace those machines, will accept the risk that if there's a fraud. That to me is where you're really talking about in the real world, these risk-based decisions and helping clients, prioritize the things that matter most in terms of risk mitigation. And Jesse, you said something too that reminded me of of something where there's this prevailing thought. This could be a little bit spicy too, but there's this thing in the MSP community I see a lot around accepting risk, right? Oh my God, I told my client to do this. They're not going to do it. And I'm going to have them fill out this form. And it's going to say that I informed them of the risk and they're accepting it and I don't own it and they do and all that. But I'm going to stop there. I have certain feelings about that where you're, as an MSP, I'm working with a client and they refuse to do something that I'm saying is important, and they're saying, no, we're not going to do it. And now I'm going to have them formally in a document sign off that they're accepting the risk. I have a feeling about this. I'll share it in a second, but I'm curious what you guys think about that.
It's like you didn't get you didn't really have an in-depth conversation about it. It's a free pass, right? It's a get out of jail free card, but is it really a get out of jail free card? You're still going to probably not have that client at the end of the day when something goes wrong. So,
Well,
yeah, that's one of the risks, right? From the MSP perspective, right?
I think I think that's the quickest way to turn it into an adversarial relationship. So I'm not for it. I think there's other ways to go about it. And this is from me talking in the trenches, right? Back in 2014, I built my first VCSO program for the MSP I was working for, and we went and delivered risk assessments to every single client. Okay. And we did that and showed them, hey, you'd be at 90% risk without our MSP services. With our patching and MFA and other things you're doing, that brings you down to about 70 or 60% risk. But there's still a delta there, right? So we recommend that you do EDR, our managed detection and response, that you have an incident response plan in place. You have VC, so all these things that are, low watermark for the program. We had several clients say, no, we're not doing that. We're fine. So do we say, no, let's go ahead them sign something and be like, ha, that's a gotcha. CYA. No, but we did our due care. We told them what the risks were. It was a relationship. And when one got hit with ransomware, a very large one, they paid us $250,000 in incident response and then signed up for security afterwards and stayed our client and one of our best clients. So that's proof in the pudding that works well.
I mean, I think, I hear a little bit about what Brian's saying, and I see this a lot. Like, that's the whole point of a risk register, right? Provide them an opportunity to understand where their risks are, because you started with what, Brian? A BIA. You started with, what are the crown jewels? What are the things? We helped you identify the areas of risk. Bad milk, only one milk supplier, crappy fridge. We've identified those areas of risk. We put them on a risk register and we let you make those decisions. We're going to consult you on those decisions. We're going to help you through the best practices for those decisions. But at the end of the day, the MSP, it's not my risk. It's theirs. So, things like a risk register could help those conversations, right? At least that's how I see it, Brian. Prove me wrong.
I think it helps, Tim, but I think the quantification of how dangerous is one supplier or one of milk or, some of the things you just mentioned, right? And that's what I love about Jesse's program, where you and Jesse, you can probably talk about how you quantify all the risks and how you end up with, it's a little bit of a hand wave, but it's the process of going through the hand wave and getting to some kind of rough numbers of how dangerous is this risk and how dangerous is that risk, and collectively, what can I reduce? What can I spend the least amount of money and take the most risk off the board? So,
yeah. I'll talk to that, but I want Brian to weigh in here.
I think you all hit some key points there. I think this concept of saying, hey, I jumped up and down. I told my client that they need to do this, right? They have to buy this tool, or they have to add this out of my stack or whatever, and they're refusing to do it. So I'm going to have them sign off on the risk, and they're going to accept it. Is an epic fail on the MSP's part. The reason the client didn't do something is because the MSP failed to put it in a way that the client could understand, react to, and put resources behind it. Yep. And there is nothing, and Jesse, you had a great story that feeds this. There is nothing more bonding with you and your client, nothing stickier than when you're connecting with them on an emotional level. And even if they didn't do what you said to do, and you said, yeah, all right, well, let's put in these things, right? You talked about incident response. You talked about compensating controls. Okay, I get it. You don't want to move on this right now, but let's work together to shrink the risk here. right? To shrink the impact, to shrink the probability. There's other things we can do. It's not perfect. It's not what I'm recommending, but I'm in this with you. Okay.
Right. Yep.
And I think that to me, and you all touched on different aspects of that, right? Is you don't wash your hands of it and walk away. The client made a decision. It's not the one we would recommend, but we need to support them in the best way possible and do it. I call this the gas station sushi problem. You know, sometimes, right?
Gas station sushi. It's the airport sushi to worry about.
Yeah, or airport sushi, right? And so it's that, right? You're at the gas station, you just got gas, you missed lunch, you're starving, you're at the checkout thing, and you look over and there's that sushi sandwich or whatever, and it's cheap, and you're there, and it's convenient, and it's easy, and you get it, right? But it creates a problem later, potentially, right? And so our job is to, you know, if our client wants to get the gas station sushi, right? Whether we say, I wouldn't do that. I had other clients eat that too, and they ended up in a bad spot. But you know, let's work on this together, and I'll have the Pepto-Bismol ready, right? I'll get another case of toilet paper for you, you know, whatever that looks like. I'm going to put in some contingencies and some compensating things to help you out. I'm not going to have you sign a form and say, I told you not to eat the sushi. You're eating that sushi and you're going to accept the risk. Of course they accept the risk. They got to live. They're accountable for it. They're going to pay the bill. They're going to pay the price. You don't have to put it in a form, but at the same time, you need, and I think Tim had a great suggestion too on the risk register. That gets the visibility and accountability and the idea that, hey, it's out there. But then I also want to talk about something else that, as we've talked about this, and the stream of consciousness is awesome, but something very important the last, I'll say, 2 years in audits that is being missed a lot around risk. And Jesse, you said something that reminded me of it too. But just because we treat a risk doesn't mean it's 100% gone.
Thank you.
There's residual risk. And let me tell you what, I've sat through a few ISO audits over the past, again, year or two, got dinged on this with one client. So sharing a little wisdom here. Auditors are putting a lot of significance on residual risk. And how is that seen? Because oftentimes what happens is we treat a risk, right? We do something to shrink the risk there, and then it's forgotten, but there's this other residual risk hanging out there because we weren't able to mitigate all of it. So residual risk is creating, I'll say, a compliance risk for a lot of different folks, because that drops off the risk register, off the radar, and residual risk is still there. And let me tell you, the residual risk is that thing that you forget about because it lacks the visibility that can bite you in the ass if you don't have it accounted for. Okay, so again, just because we've treated a risk or decided what to do with it doesn't mean that there isn't residual risk that's equally important to get to. And sometimes it's the fringe stuff we forget about that comes back later and bites us.
Oh, you mean residual risk? Like we talked about it. It's 70-something degrees here.
Well, that's why we
sneeze it off. Like, residual risk. Like, oh, I should probably close my window.
Yeah. So good stuff. But
he's doing it.
I had to close that window because I'm literally dying here with my nose running all over my face. Sorry.
So, well, that's the thing. It's a great point. So to illustrate that for people that are trying to wrap their head around the concept of residual risk, like the best way I could put it is that's why there's different implementation groups on the CIS controls. So if you treated every single control, which you probably haven't, if you did on implementation group 1, what happens when you apply implementation group 2 to your risk assessment? Immediately you open up a bunch more findings and risk. So there's always some sort of risk in the environment. So that's important. And that leads in to what Tim said, something that I wanted to cover next and hear from you all on is, what is a risk assessment? Like this is a hotly contested topic. And Brian's smiling because he knows where we're going with this. But, quantification versus qualification, right? We can't call this a risk assessment because we're using percentages. we're using, stoplight type scenario, high, medium, low weights. Yeah. And I'll acquiesce that that's not a true risk assessment, but it goes back to Tim, what you mentioned about like a business or, how do we work with the client to give them what they need and get them started and start somewhere? Because again, okay, yeah, if I'm going to come in and do a quantitative risk assessment with fair modeling and everything else and give you like monetary scores on all of that, I'm going to have tool costs. I'm going to have personnel costs. It's going to cost
Brain
you 30,
damage.
40, 50, 60. Yeah, that's right. And so what can I do? I can give you a more, Tim, you said hand wave. I don't like that term. I'm going to use it. I'm going to give you more of a hand wave. I'll give you more of a hand wave assessment based on my talking to you about how you're using those things, right? That goes back to getting those critical controls figured out. And that's going to get you at least started. We're going to get an idea and get a direction, a compass direction for how to head with the security program. So I'm just going to throw that out there, and I'd like to get people's thoughts on that.
I think it's difficult, like where you start, right? Like at the end of the day, you need to resonate with the leader or the owner of the business. So you're going to have that conversation that's not tech right away. But how do you get down to a point where you said you're going to have some kind of risk assessment that it's going to be tech heavy, right? I mean, a lot of people's risk assessments are done off of CIS-1 or NIST or whatever. So I don't know. I'd like to hear from Mr. Golden, right? Like, how do you, what's going on over in those walls? What are you teaching your MSPs to start the conversation so that they're not like, no,
Yeah, it's interesting. We've been running peer group here for a while, and we've been helping those MSPs mature over time. A lot of it kind of boils back down to just business basics, right? Whether you read a book, take a course, whatever, it's just really understanding, like, get your mind out of the ones and zeros, flashy lights, bytes and bits, right? I hate to say our team, me, whatever, we built this little like assessment. I'm not going to use the word risk. We built this assessment, although it does have quantifiable data and scoring and pieces, but it doesn't talk about a single technical control. And we broke this assessment up into sales department, marketing department, accounting department, board of directors, blah, 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 blah. And it had literally nothing to do with CIS 1.2, CMMC 16.4. It was literally questions on, who has administrative access to your CRM? Oh, everybody. Well, why does everybody have full administrator access to your CRM? That salesperson that, you're kind of on the fence with, should they have full admin rights, be able to download and export and take your list and leave? So it talks nothing. So what we teach and what we kind of walk people through is get your mind out of the bytes, bits, 1, 0, and hold on. And flashy lights. Get your mind out of the ones and zeros and the flashy lights, right? And start having business related conversations.
So
right?
It sounds like you talked about like the employee leading, right? So do you lead with kind of these are the bad things that are very common, or like I said, it's a little bit of a dance. And Brian, a lot of the businesses you work with, I'm sure you kind of know the business before you walk in the door.
Yeah, some of it, but I can tell you, what's common in the MSP space, and Jesse's probably seen this, where you've got I'll call them the vCISO want-to-bes, or the security. They're actually, they're somebody that wants to go down the security path and starts having these conversations in QBRs, and they'll do their first risk assessment, right? Mm-hmm. And this is the common thing, right? Especially as technical people, and that's where you gravitate. But what's common is they'll get this shiny new gigantic freaking spreadsheet with multiple tabs and all these cool calculations and all this kind of stuff.
I was literally just pulling up one of these.
Something like that, right?
So
what do they do? if the organization has like their own IT, or they're doing a co-managed thing, or if it's a larger client, typically what happens is they get a bunch of expensive engineering technical people on a call. Okay. They've got their shiny new spreadsheet and they start going line by line. Okay. Whether it's control based or you got the categories. And so each time you go through and you ask a bunch of expensive people on a Zoom call a question, right? Let's use something simple. Is MFA enabled? In what environment, right? In what product? What do you mean? You start getting the question, what's the scope, right? And so the scope isn't well articulated, and it is like gets very, very confusing because a lot of clients have customer facing systems and multiple environments and things like that. So those are extremely ineffective, and there's big misses that happen sometimes with that. If you don't have, and this is where I would advocate you start. And Tim, do I know the business when I go? I think I know. I have some assumptions, right? What you kind of see on the website and some of that, but I really want to dig into the down and dirty with the people that really understand the business. C-level people, stakeholders, they love to talk about themselves, their own business, just like we do, right? So they go in and so what I really want to understand, and I just start drawing a diagram, and MSP's always like, what tool do you use? What's it? Use a napkin and a pen. It doesn't have to be where it's Lucid Charts or Visio or Smart Drawer. That can come later. You're just trying to get a little sketch, right? We're visual creatures as people, as humans. We like pictures. So you start asking questions about them and their business. Oh, you start, how did you get into this business? What's exciting about it to you? What's your passion? What's the competition look like? What are your goals? But I mean, then you start with, it gets down to, oh, well, tell me about your revenue. I don't need numbers. You don't need to tell me actual numbers if you don't want to, but percentages. Tell me about your business. And Tim, this is where I get in. I might talk to a CPA firm and I might assume that they get most of their revenue through doing taxes, for example. And then I talk to them and they say, well, Brian, 80% of our revenue comes from M&A transactions. We do a lot of due diligence and that kind of work around that. So 80% of our revenue comes from doing M&A transactions. What am I drawing a picture of and circling? That, right?
Yep.
80% of the revenue that they get. I don't need to know, is it 10 million, 100 million? It's 80% of their livelihood, 80% of their blood, comes from this one thing. And so then I draw a circle around that, right? Yeah. Right. 80% of the revenue comes from M&A. Oh, really? Do you mind sharing a little bit more about that? Who's involved in that? How does the work first come in? And so what I'm starting to do is build out a level 0 for you nerds that are listening in, a level 0 diagram, which is just understanding at the highest level the people, the processes, and technology, right? The humans doing things with technology. What are they doing, right? And how are they doing it? How follow the bouncing ball of the data. And then I start to get this picture. 80% of the revenue. Here's the different people that I need to talk to when I'm doing some of this risk assessment work. And then I start to understand the tools and the applications and that. So you can see why some of these playbooks and some of these other things that guide people through this kind of journey, they start with, give me your list of applications, or they start with, give me a list of the servers or services, and they go right to the IT. And now everything they do after that is IT related versus having this 15-minute conversation up front.
Right.
Everything I do behind the scenes, my heat maps and all this other scatter diagrams and cool dashboards and stuff, I want to have their vernacular, their language. If they call a widget a gadget, I better call it a gadget. If they call customers clients, I call them clients because I want my deliverables. I want when I'm talking to them and articulating the risk in their environment. I don't care about these CVSS scores and all that, but I am saying, within this ecosystem that drives 80% of your revenue, that M&A transactions that you do, 80% of your revenue, you've got some critical risks that we need to take care of. And it's going to cost you X to protect 80% of your revenue. What do you want to do? Or I'm going to put together a roadmap and I'm going to prioritize the things, right, where where we need to attack first that shrink risks to 80% of your M&A work that you do. Right? It resonates, and I'm a million miles away from controls. I'm a million miles away from IG this or IG that. Right? When I'm communicating to stakeholders and I want to get their wallets out, and I want to get emotional and I want to get sticky with them, those are the conversations I go back to. The 15 minutes when I'm drawing on the back of a paper or something like that, I go back to that often. And you can always make the diagram pretty later, but that's where I think is the best place to start. And I'll finish here with this little diatribe. What I've seen oftentimes, if people don't have this business context discussion, we go to our assumptions. Okay.
Yeah.
IT people, we're going right to IT. And I saw this miss just about 6 months ago on a risk assessment that another organization did. They didn't have the conversation with the client, and they didn't realize email and some of the email related systems and Office 365 and all that guys, that's not important to them.
Right.
Their phone system was. The phone system's the most important thing in their whole business because of the way their business flow is, the way their SLAs are with their client. The phone system, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't even covered in the risk assessment,
Yeah.
right? It was nowhere in there. And then a 15-minute conversation with the client, you figure out phones.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's funny that you say that, because several years ago, similar concept, right? I sat with a business owner and I, kind of had the conversation like, how important is email? How important is this? And he's like, I could care less about email. We're on conference calls all day long. All the people are on a phone all day long, which told me no VoIP, the copper all day, because I can't trust VoIP at that point.
Mm-hmm.
It was the only client that I could literally walk over and turn off the Exchange server for a day or two and nobody would complain. But Brian, you make a really good analogy. Like, if you didn't ask how important phones are, you'd never know.
Well,
we talked about the phone went down, you'd know about it.
We talked about this as for contracts though too, and oftentimes you can tell if you can sample, some of the client contracts. You'll see, for example, their SLAs are driven where they have to answer the phones. This particular client had SLAs with some of the largest insurance companies on the planet that they had to answer the phone and do all this other stuff within 30 seconds, right? And so then you start to realize I've got a big circle around the phone system. That is a huge part of the technology that's being used that drives SLAs and contractual commitments too.
So Jesse,
for those,
I was going to say, why don't you chime in about where we're where we are right now, where your head's at?
Yeah, just before we move off this topic, I wanted to point something out that I say is very critical in terms of creating clear edges and creating profitable VCSO and risk programs for your clients. Is something Brian said is using their language, their vernacular, and their business outcomes. So we're talking risk assessments, but hey, by the way, those are copy techniques, copywriting, marketing techniques, right? And that should be, we talk about connective tissue, that should be front to back how we build our program. So when you're sitting down and having a talk with a potential client, and maybe the risk assessment is a offer magnet that you're doing first, but then when you go to build your scope of work, in the scope of work, you reference their vernacular, those systems, those business outcomes that you referred to, and your scope of work becomes an emotionally attractive thing to them, right? Versus somebody else who came in and said, hey, we're going to help you with your risk program. Sign off on the dotted line. Who do you think is winning that deal? You are, right? Because you've done that and you've made it applicable to their business and you've attached them emotionally to your scope of work. So just some things to think about is that it's a connected process. And we're talking about risk assessments, but this is, linked through to your sales and your rep ops and everything else.
Exactly.
I caught that too, Jesse. I think that was the number. That was just a great little gem Ryan dropped about the vernacular, the vocabulary, because it really does differ dramatically. Like real estate investing, they have like different acronyms, right? Like if you know those terms, like you're going to sound like you belong. So.
And ask too. Don't make assumptions. Like my dumb CPA example I said before, where I said 80% of their stuff comes from M&A. ask them, oh, I want to put this here. What do you call that process? Get to know the inside language and the inside jargon. You are going to differentiate yourself from probably everybody else that's competing to get that client because you took the time to ask and care, right? Oh, what do you call that process? Oh, we call it the, M&A or thingy. And so you put that in there, and then everything you say is whatever they say, right? You become one of them. You're sitting on the same side of the table as them. You have common interests, common language.
And that goes right to Jesse's point that he always talks about, which is if you start using their language, their vernacular in their world, what do you get out of that, Jesse? You get to niche your ICP.
Yeah.
And now you can find a similar customer who you've already learned the language.
Yeah. We had Robert Gillette in the Power Grid, I think it was last week, to do an AMA. And I love what he said about that. And it was if you're niching down, and if you have a really true ICP, all of those customers should be able to look at each other and say, we look the same, right? So you could say banks are my ICP. Well, that's not an ICP because Wells Fargo looks a lot different than your local regional bank, right? So I thought that was a very astute observation on somebody who's a sales professional.
Well, two things come to mind with what you said, Jesse. Pain and wisdom. Yeah. If I am in a niche and margin is in the niche, okay? Right. If I'm in the niche, I've lived through with the clients pain and I've gained wisdom. Yeah. And if you can show when you're talking to this other prospects that's similar to the other niche that you're in, and you are talking, you are saying stuff that's on their mind without the prompt, you identify with their pain and you share the wisdom that you've gained from that. And it's so nichey. And for anybody listening, margin is in the niche. Margin is in the niche. So if you're thinking about speciating a certain area, a certain ideal client profile kind of thing, and going narrow and deep, competition shrinks, margins increase. Always.
Yeah. It's the Peter Thiel talk. Competition is for losers. And he talks about you want to hyper focus and then create a monopoly in the smallest niche you can, and then replicate that, right? It was the PayPal model. It was the Amazon model. It's the SaaS growth model, right? And we can apply that as MSPs.
Yep.
Ooh, I like that. Hey, by the way, your risk spidey sense gets better too then, because when you talk to a company and you hear something, you say, oh, I know where the problems are here, right?
You know right where to go. Yeah.
Exactly where to go. So let me bring us full circle. We kind of started out with like, what is risk? We kind of talked a little bit of, Jesse kind of led us into like finding something that has an adverse effect. I'm paraphrasing. Brian kind of led us down this conversation of not what is it, but why is it, right? And kind of the components around having that conversation, kind of walking us through a little bit about the business side, right? We kind of all tapped into like, don't ask them about IG 4769. Don't get the blinky lights going. Ask them how they made. Ask them why they got into this business to begin with. Ask them, what are you passionate? What gets you out of bed as opposed to what keeps you up? You hear this a lot in the space. What keeps you up at night? Why are you afraid? What do you worry about? How about we flip that conversation, shift left, i.e. why Team Tim exists, and asks, what gets you out of bed? What excites you? What is important to you in your business? And out of those conversations, as Brian said, you're going to learn phone systems, number one. I love talking on or email or whatever it is. Ask them instead of what keeps them up. Ask them instead what motivates you and get out of bed in the morning to go do the work that you've been doing for X number of years. What are you passionate about and why? Which will drive that conversation to understand the napkin math of what needs to be circled, as Brian said.
Yeah, I love that, Tim. Perfect guest today, and Brian here. That logical kind of where do you start, where do you go, thinking 3 chess moves ahead. collecting that vernacular, and also, as you said, like you're just driving kind of into those areas. Like a great example, like phones are important, right? So how much are you spending on email security, and how much are you spending on, phone redundancy or whatnot? So who's ready for takeaways, Tim? Get out of here for the weekend.
Yeah, so we always try to leave Team Tim with all of you wanting more to come back in 2 weeks. And we leave that because we have an opportunity to provide key takeaways. So, Mr. Miller, Dr. Jesse, what is your key takeaway today?
Our key takeaway is order your risk treatment. Okay. Order it in the business way. That is, you can either avoid, transfer, accept, and then mitigate if it's outside the risk tolerance.
I love the 5 risk treatments. If only there was a risk register that had. Oh, sorry, I digress. Brian or Tim, are either of who's next on wanting to go next?
Sure. We'll leave the spotlight here to Brian at the end, but I just love where this conversation kind of started. We went with like, why doesn't the risk conversation happen with small organizations? Because we don't contextually understand their business. So we need to understand their business. The better we can understand their business, the better we can pivot resources and achieve that, optimal risk buy down on these new risks that have been unearthed and quantified during this conversation. So this is definitely one of my favorite episodes. Brian.
Mr. Brian.
Yeah, I think for me, if it's one thing that I want MSPs to understand, is if you want your risk assessments and your roadmaps to be reacted to and acted on in a positive way, that means, hey, I've done this risk assessment, I put together the roadmap, I prioritized the things that need to be fixed. These are important things to help the client's security posture and risk profile. I want them to take action. If you, as an MSP, if you want to do the risk assessment roadmap and have your client react in a positive way, that means they're going to buy stuff from you because you're solving problems, connect it, provide business context, and business impact in a way that the client can understand it and react to it. And the only way you're going to do that, spend the 10 or 15 minutes getting to know your client, the way they make money, and the humans doing things with technology, follow the bouncing ball of the data, and then all of your risk assessment work and roadmap is in the language of their business, not language of business, but in their specific business with their vernacular in a way that they can react to it and move forward. Not only will you earn the client, but it's a way longer term in your reporting, right? The risk assessments aren't one and done, right? You keep doing this, right? Threat landscape, everything changes, their business changes, all that kind of good stuff. Ongoing, earn the business and then keep the business in an ongoing way, because your ongoing reporting can continue to show them how their investments in you are shrinking the risk in the areas that are most important to them.
I suppose it's my turn, huh? I would say stop talking about blinking lights, ones and zeros, bytes and bits, and shift that conversation with your MSP clients to something a little more positive, a little more business oriented around, instead of asking what keeps you up at night, shift that and ask what gets you out of bed. What motivates you? Why did you start this company? What widgets are you most proud of here? And dig deeper into that positive business conversation that can then eventually lead to uncovering the areas of potential risk. So when I think, what is risk? I think of uncovering those potential areas of things that could break, things that could impact the widgets that they make, the things that they do, and providing services and all the good stuff around. Great. We've talked to you. We know you're a call center. Phones are very important. Great. Big circle around the phones. So if it were me and my advice to MSPs listening here today, stop talking about blinking lights, shift the conversation, start asking what gets you out of bed, what motivates you, and why do you do the things that you do, and then continue that conversation into discovering and uncovering those potential areas of hidden risk before you dive into blinky lights. And that brings us right to 3 o'clock. So 2 weeks from now, do we have something lined up, Mr. Tim?
Well, we're going to announce that on Monday. I'm working on a couple things. So,
all righty. So
surprise.
Yep.
Ooh, awesome sauce. Awesome sauce. Brian, thank you so much for joining us here on Team Tim. Obviously, Tim and Jesse, we're obviously glad to have everybody here. Look for us in 2 weeks on Monday. Mr. Schnurr is going to put something out there. For those of you that are going to be at IT Nation next week, I'm actually attending as my MSP. I'm really excited because I get to actually sit in sessions. Oh, am I not supposed to say that? Okay, whatever.
You chameleon, you chameleon.
I should have the MSP. I still do work over there. Yeah.
I paid for the vendor pass, so
yeah.
So yeah, for those that'll be there, let's grab coffee. For those that are not, we'll see you in a couple of weeks at the next show, or we'll see you on Team 10. So thanks, everybody.
See you in the sun. Bye, guys.
Subscribe now.